Once upon a time there was a queen. She had it all, the glory, the power, worshippers eager to give and grateful to receive. Why? Because she had the gift of the gifts, the blessing of the blessings hers to bestow. And her place of worship? Oh, that was the place to be. It was good times. Kings didn't like that. Kings came one after the other to knock her off her throne. But they didn't last long. When the queen was done with you, you were gone. Worse ways to go, but the kings, they kept coming after her. The queen's power, which is the power of all women, the power of rebirth and creation. It makes some men kneel in awe and give gifts, but it makes other men angry. Do you know it? Anger gets stuff done. Or Nancy said something close to that about the character Bilquis in American Gods. And Bilquis is known through most of history as the Queen of Sheba. The stories of the Queen of Sheba have undergone extensive elaborations across different cultures, from the Jews, Islam and Ethiopia as time's gone on, and she has also become the subject of one of the most widespread fertility legends in the Orient. But is she the character we see on American Gods? Or is there more to her magic than meets the eye? So welcome to the story of the Queen of Sheba, and welcome to Cercganford. The Queen of Sheba has seen many myths and legends spawn from her reputation as a beautiful, rich and sometimes magical queen. A queen desired by kings, and this may be the reason so many stories have been seeded about her. And within the story of American Gods, we'll look to see if many of these myths have been combined to make the character of Bilqis. So let's pull back these layers, these stories, to see if we can find out what her powers were and the real story behind the Queen of Sheba. The first and therefore oldest mention of the Queen of Sheba in the historical record is within the Hebrew Bible, where her name is never stated. She is mentioned with respect to her visit to King Solomon, and this is written in the Book of Kings and Chronicles too, where it is said she brought with her gold, precious stones and abundance of spices to give to the king. Now King Solomon is said to have reigned from 970 BCE to 931 BCE, and so this provides our first clue of when to look for her in history. But just because it is in the Bible doesn't mean this event happened, or that there was even a Queen of Sheba, or even a King Solomon. And to emphasise this, we know that the books of Kings was written around the middle of the 6th century BCE, and Chronicles 2 was written in the 5th century BCE. And this is because of the language used and the lack of mention of the fall of the Babylonian Empire within those books. Now, with the story of Sheba being written almost 500 years after her appearance, there is bound to be a little digression from the truth, and this is something we see in stories all the time. However, it is also said by Hebrew scholars in the Talmud, which is the Hebrew Bible, when mentioning the Queen of Sheba, that it was actually referring to the land of Sheba rather than an actual queen, and so this casts further doubt on her existence. But we do have some dates to help us track her down, and clues to her kingdom's resources. So with these clues, if there is an historical Queen of Sheba, we should look to find out where the queen could have come from, as there aren't any geographic clues to where Sheba is within the biblical writings, but it could be referring to a real place. Well, scholars generally identify Sheba as a real kingdom known as the Kingdom of Saba, which is in modern-day Yemen in Arabia, and it's centred around an oasis of Marib. Now, the kingdom had fame for dealing in the frankincense and myrrh trade, and this may have helped encourage the use of the phrase an abundance of spices that was in the text of the Chronicles, so hinting at what could have been brought from the region of Saba to King Solomon. However, whilst the Kingdom of Saba had these resources, it wasn't until near the 8th century that the stories mention when the Queen meets with King Solomon hint at. And so this leads us to our first concern over whether the story could be true, or whether it's an amalgamation of facts and stories throughout time. And to iterate this further, there are no written inscriptions from South Arabia, not in that region, of the Queen of Sheba, in fact any female ruler. However, to counter that, there are many references to Arab queens from Assyrian inscriptions, and queens are well attested to in Arabia, but this attestation stops around the start of the 7th century BCE. So we're also aware that the Sabaean tribes used the title Makwituit, meaning high official, and this seems to be cognate with Makwida, which is the personal name of the Queen of Sheba in the Ethiopian legends, which were written later in history, and we'll visit those in a few minutes. But the link cannot be proven for certain, nor associated with the Queen of Sheba specifically. However, even today, with much excavation carried out at all sites in Yemen, thought to be associated with the Queen of Sheba, there has been no references to her found. So whilst currently her historicity seems doubtful, if we make a jump to the assumption that she was real, could the Queen of Sheba have visited King Solomon at the time he ruled, whether or not she had the wealth associated with her? Well, there are references to trade caravans of camels travelling to Mesopotamia from Saba in the 9th century BCE, and maybe as early as the 10th century BCE. And this is probably just on the edge of the possible timeline that a trade caravan could also well have gone to Jerusalem. So if the Queen of Sheba was real, she would have had to have been born no later than 970 BCE and possibly as early as 990 BCE in order to be old enough to visit Solomon and for him to have an interest in her, because he had interests in females quite significantly. So things don't look too promising in believing the Bible story. And perhaps it was just combining other myths and incidents just to create that narrative of the story. But what I do know, we can look at in the Kingdom of Saba in more detail. And people from this area were known as Sabaeans. And we know that these people migrated to other areas of the region, and some of these established settlements in the Ethiopian and Eritrean regions of Africa, an area that would eventually become known as the realm of Aksum. And whilst by land the journey between Yemen and Ethiopia is around 4,000 kilometres or 2,500 miles, by sea it was just 600 kilometres, less than 400 miles, and this migration has been confirmed through DNA evidence, with about half the population of what was Aksum showing ancestry from Yemen. However, in another twist, this Kingdom of Aksum didn't actually exist until, not as a political entity anyway, until the start of the 2nd century CE, although it did evolve from the previous kingdom called Dmut, which was also influenced by the Sabaean culture just across the sea. Meaning, once again, the stories we are finding out seem to be a consolidation of many tales and facts throughout time pulled together. Now, the Kingdom of Aksum, that has generated many of the myths of the Queen of Sheba, well, her stories there have a huge significance in the area because of the belief of Ethiopian Christians that the Queen was a real and powerful figure, despite what we know so far. So why is this? Well, this is all down to a book called Kerba Nagast, which means Glory of the Kings, and it is considered a national epic of Ethiopia, and it was written in the 14th century CE. Now, the book, amongst its tales, tells the story of how the Queen of Sheba, who at the time worshipped the sun, heard of King Solomon's wisdom and went to visit him. Now, the king's wisdom convinced the queen to stop worshipping the sun and worship the God of Israel instead. And the night before the queen left to travel back to her kingdom, King Solomon tricks her into bed, and then in the morning he gives her a ring to allow their child to identify themselves to Solomon in the future. So the queen journeys home and she gives birth to a son called Menelik. Now, 22 years later, Menelik, wearing this ring, travels to Jerusalem to seek King Solomon's blessing, which the king gives before trying to persuade Menelik to stay and become his heir. But Menelik wants to go back home to Ethiopia, not to Saba. It states Ethiopia, and so the King Solomon sends with Menelik the firstborn sons of his elders, and these sons are not happy to leave their home, so they steal the Ark of the Covenant, which is a golden wooden casket holding the 10 Commandments that God gave to Moses, an incredibly sacred relic to the Abrahamic Church, and they take it with them without Menelik's knowledge. But during his journey home, Menelik finds out about the Ark, But before we can do anything about it, the ark flies him home to Ethiopia. Such is the power of Yahweh. This makes King Solomon distraught, betrayed by God, and in that frame of mind, he is seduced by his wife, who is the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and she convinces Solomon to worship the gods of Egypt. Now, this story raises lots of questions, such as why is Menelik travelling home to Ethiopia from Jerusalem rather than Saba to Yemen, as it's inferred in the Hebrew Bible? Where is the Queen of Sheba expected to come from? Is it Saba or Ethiopia? And what happened to the Ark of the Covenant? If indeed anything happened to it, if it's real, which it probably isn't. Well, there's been much archaeological work carried out around what is the area of the Kingdom of Aksum, and this has uncovered royal seals and monuments. However, again, none give mention to the Queen or her son. With such an impressive story of the Queen and her son, then even without this evidence, why would your culture not want to believe that it's real? And I feel that is a belief that is preached to Ethiopian Christians even today by the Ethiopian Church. So, with the curb and the gas considered historically accurate by many Ethiopian Christians, it is then just a small step to believe that the Ark of the Covenant is actually in their possession. And this is actually the case, and it is allegedly being located in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Now, some academics have had access to it, although I haven't been able to examine it in detail. They suggest it's nothing more than a middle-aged forgery, with nothing in it. But it now may be too late to ever find out formally, as in December 2020, which is just over a month ago from this recording, the Ethiopian army attacked the church to allegedly seize the ark. And the outcome of this has not yet been publicly verified. All we see is that news agents are relaying the danger the fighting is posing to these historical sites. But it could be that this is now lost forever. With regards to the story of the Queen of Sheba within the Curb and the Gast, it seems to be about as reliable as the Bible, especially considering when it was written and that it contains much influence from biblical books, and it is itself a copy of an older translation, probably written in Coptic and then Arabic before being translated into what's called Ge'ez by the Ethiopian clerics. Now, there's also one other inconsistency, and that is that worshipping of the sun by the Queen of Sheba. You see, the main deity of the Sabaeans, and we have proof of this through archaeological evidence, is the moon god called Al-Makah, a god that probably influenced not only in Saba but potentially in Demut, and therefore possibly Aksum. So why is the queen seen as worshipping the sun rather than the moon? So, considering all this, we are no closer to finding any proof to support any belief that the Queen of Sheba was real. Why she is portrayed as having magical powers in American gods? Well, there are a couple more avenues I want to look at, and the first is of Islam, where the Queen is mentioned in the Quran. And the story goes that Solomon, who himself used to worship the sun, invited the Queen of Sheba to stop worshipping the sun and instead, like King Solomon, should start worshipping Allah. The Queen sends ambassadors to King Solomon bearing gifts, to which he is disappointed and returns them saying that if he has to travel to her to convince her to change who she worships, he will bring an army she will not defeat. So the Queen, not wishing to go to war, goes to visit King Solomon. A story in itself that has many versions, including genies or jinns, and a miracle from Allah or two, as well as trickery to see if the Queen had goat's feet and hairy legs. And that's done by making her walk on a floor of glass that she thinks is water. And this marvel of engineering convinces her to worship Allah. Simple. So, King Solomon then marries the Queen, or in other versions of stories allows another king to marry her, and in other tales she turns out to be the daughter of a Genie, and so has some magical powers. And this association of the Queen with a jinn or a genie are both told in Islam's hadith or Islamic tradition, is considered some attempts to demonise her and to reduce her reputation as a woman, and in such is seen as a reflection of Islam's attitudes towards women. But The other influence Islam has on her story is that her name is known within these texts as Bilquis. Within these Islamic tradition, the Hadith, and that's the name she's called within American Gods. However, the thing that counters this is the portrayal of Bilquis of someone of African heritage, not Persian or Arabian. So why is this? Well, the background of Bilquis became a lot clearer in the storyline of American Gods come Season 3, Episode 4. So don't watch any further if you haven't seen this. And this is because whilst locked up in a cell, she prayed and was visited by a deity who is known as Ocean. Now, Ocean is from the African pantheon known as the Orisa, the Yoruba. It's a pantheon with 401 deities. It's huge, and they have a commonality throughout the region of Africa where they're worshipped. And because of the size of this pantheon and the geographic spread of the worship of the gods, many, many gods, they can all appear in different forms and even different sexes amongst these stories. But here, Ocean is the goddess of love, beauty and fertility, and one of the most popular deities in the Yoruba region, which is sort of Nigeria, in fact, around there. So why is Ocean visiting Bilquis? Well, one clan who worship her is called Ichibu. And so this clan can be considered part of the Yoruba people. They live in an area of West Africa where there is a defensive structure called Sungbol's Eredu, is dedicated to the Queen of Sheba. And that is probably the largest defensive structure ever built. And so there is some worship and beliefs of her here too. And although her name is not Bilquis here, but Oloye Likisu Sungbol, and the defensive structure was built around 800 to 1000 CE, date-wise, so it doesn't seem to be built for the Queen anywhere near the lifetime if she visited King Solomon or was a historical person. There may be influences here from the Islamic religion and the Quran. So with this information, I feel we can reach some sort of conclusion about the Bilquis of American Gods and the one documented Queen of Sheba. Now, the character of Bilquis is undoubtedly influenced primarily by Islamic myths of the Queen of Sheba along with the West African influence she has. But the Queen of Sheba of Islam and Christianity is a merger based on myths and truths at different points in the past, but which together form the myth that has led itself to many more stories, almost self-perpetuating these myths. But the biggest myth of all is that the Queen of Sheba was a real and historical person, which we can say with a high degree of certainty that she was not. And as Bilquis, she was only magical in specific stories that appeared 1500 years after she was supposed to have lived, again enforcing the idea that myths evolved with times, giving her more powers and mystery as time evolved. And that is not an uncommon trait amongst national heroes. And you see this in this kind of development in stories such as King Arthur. Now, American Gods has used her many myths to create this character with a diverse and ancient past. But to summarise the narrative of the Queen of Sheba, this is a real synopsis. It is just another story of sex, power and politics that is a common one throughout the history of storytelling, but one that has had the benefit of being spread far and wide and developed in many forms. She is an ideal character for storytelling. And with that, I hope you enjoyed what you heard and found it interesting and learned something new. And until the next video, please stay safe. Stay well. Take care. This was Cercganford.